to give this split focus talk as a UXPA webinar. We gave this talk at UXPA conference this past summer in Toronto, and people requested that we hold it again as a webinar, so it's great to have that chance now. This talk is about designing applications for people with multiple monitor setups on their desks. If we want our users to take advantage of that extra real estate that they have and those extra monitors, what kind of design considerations do we need to take into account when we're designing the user experience for our applications? And as Jenna said, we'll leave about 10 minutes at the end of the webinar for questions, and you can feed your questions into the questions panel while we're talking, and we'll address them at the end. So we're going to introduce ourselves. I am Rachel Sengers. I'm a user experience designer, and all three of us work at Design for Context. It's a consultancy in the DC area that specializes in user research and user experience design for complex applications and rich information spaces. Lisa, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks. I'm Lisa Battle. I am the founder and principal consultant at Design for Context.
And Michael?
Hi, and I am Michael Owens, and I am also a user experience designer at Design for Context. And I am going to dive right in and get started. So over the past decade, user experience professionals have been working to create interfaces that scale well to smaller and smaller screen sizes. We have all learned the strategies to scale down gracefully, and this has become part of our repertoire as designers. Today, we have a new challenge. Today, we're talking about the next big thing on the horizon for UX application design. It's not the small screen. Today, it's all about going large. Monitors are getting bigger and cheaper and better, which means more pixels for everyone, which is great if we can learn how to manage that screen real estate wisely. Today, many people, especially those working with software as a service and enterprise applications, are using 2 or more displays at any given time. They're often commuting with their laptops and plugging them into multiple configurations, both in the office and at home. Those monitors may be different sizes, different orientations, and it's frustrating for those users when applications do not scale up gracefully. They're wasting screen real estate, creating unreadable line lengths, and not taking advantage of the additional monitors to support multitasking and common tasks like side-by-side comparisons. We are increasingly seeing opportunities to improve user experience and productivity, especially for business users who are splitting their focus between multiple windows across multiple displays. Some of the challenges these new usage patterns present are currently out of our control, such as browser behavior and OS configurations. But there are some things that we can design for. Today, we'll talk about how people use multiple monitors with web-based applications, new UX design patterns, and some of the challenges they present, and some solutions to these problems. So I'm going to hand it over to Lisa.
All right, I'm going to talk briefly about some of the usability and ergonomic factors that arise in the multiple monitor world, including why users benefit from multiple monitors and what some of the downsides are. Let's start with the single monitor. Working on a single monitor forces the user to minimize windows to get them out of the way, or to overlap windows in a way that covers up information that could be important. After the windows have been minimized and are out of sight, then you need to remember how to find them again. So single monitor users often rely on the taskbar or Alt-Tab to switch back and forth between windows. Since at least 2004, researchers have been conducting experiments showing that multiple monitors lead to increases in productivity, mainly from saving that time that's lost switching between windows that are otherwise minimized or in the background. Researchers have also found decreases in error rates when users are given a task that involves switching back and forth between windows, and increased satisfaction when using 2 monitors rather than 1. There's also a lot of anecdotal evidence out there on the internet in articles, blogs, and other forums where people express that they feel like they can work faster and more effectively with more than 1 monitor. Users take advantage of that additional space to spread things out. On multiple monitors, users are more likely to keep their inactive windows visible and to click on the window itself to activate it. A study showed that users have very little empty space on their multiple monitors. The windows can also be larger because of the additional screen real estate available. In some situations, it may be possible for a user to stretch a window across multiple monitors. Some operating systems allow that, but research shows it's very rare for people to actually do that. Note that when you do that, there's a gap that occurs between the two monitors, making a gap in the window. Physical monitor boundaries act as partitions of the display space, and this seems to help us organize our virtual world similar to the way we organize physical spaces in our homes and offices, giving each area a designated purpose. Using a mouse to move the pointer between the multiple monitors is a downside to this type of work environment, though. It takes more time than with a single monitor display because of the larger distance, and there's more risk of losing your cursor. The challenges increase when there's more distance between those monitors and when there are differences in height. A researcher named Dugald Hutchings in 2012 showed that the size of the physical gap between the monitors significantly affects the actual movement time and accuracy, despite having no influence on the distance necessary for travel by the mouse to reach the target. This is interesting because it suggests a change to Fitz's law for multiple monitors. Fitz's law said, you might recall, that the time to acquire a target is a function of the distance to and the size of the target. Fitz's law showed us that the edges and the corners of the screen are the easiest places to reach. But with multiple monitors, that's not true anymore. Those edges between the monitors are now really hard to reach and so easy to overshoot the mark and lose your cursor in the next monitor. Researchers are still trying to find ways to make it easier to move quickly back and forth between monitors, such as this study by Omada in 2009, which had a pen tablet on a turntable, and the angle of the rotation of that turntable would place the cursor in the desired monitor. I don't think that's commercially available yet, but you can buy a commercial mouse that can be programmed to switch back and forth between monitors, either by pressing a button or by tilting that scroll wheel on the mouse to the left or the right. In addition to the physical movement between monitors, there's also the question of how much information a user can take in visually. This represents the field of vision, or the total range that a typical human is able to see when focusing on a single point. There's a fairly narrow area in the middle of the field of vision where people are able to read text. Outside of that area, people may notice colors and symbols, and outside of that area, they may notice movement. This is that same field of vision from your perspective looking forward. The field of vision typically has a span of 200 degrees horizontally and 120 degrees vertically. When you think about the impact of this on a person with multiple monitors, you can see that if they're focusing on reading something in one monitor, then things in an adjacent monitor are in their far peripheral view. Because the field of vision is wider than it is high, it also implies that seeing things to the left or the right in side-by-side monitors is easier than looking up, for example, if you had stacked monitors. So next, I'll turn it over to Michael to talk with us about usage patterns.
So these days, there are nearly an infinite number of applications, both native and web-based, that are available to users. And there are literally an infinite number of ways that users can implement multiple monitors on their system. In addition, users aren't stuck with one configuration and can easily flip between several throughout the day. This makes the task of identifying usage patterns rather complex. Here, we have narrowed the scope down to 5 common patterns that we see represented specifically in the world of enterprise applications. The first persona we're going to discuss is the multitasker. This pattern consists of an unrelated task in each monitor and is the classic example of split focus. This user could be answering email on one screen and working on a Photoshop file on the other. Often, there is a main task that the user is currently working on. In that scenario, a user may physically be closer to or oriented toward that task to keep it in their primary field of focus. We would label that monitor the user's dominant display. The researcher persona is also splitting their focus between 2 separate applications, but in this scenario, they are related to a single task, and the secondary monitor is playing the supporting role. This user will have the application for their task in their dominant monitor and related reference material in another app on their second display. This app may be a browser displaying a search engine or a Word document being used as a reference. For example, a user might be updating a comp based on an email exchange or changing code based on a Jira task, where the action is in one monitor and the information used to complete it is displayed in the second window as a reference. Again, in this usage pattern, the main task window might be considered a dominant monitor that the user is physically oriented towards. The third persona we're going to talk about today is the inspector. Like the researcher, this user is performing a single task across both displays, but they don't necessarily have a dominant view. Both monitors might display similar documents or slightly different versions of the same document or lines of code, or one monitor might be a rendered view of the code that the user is continually refreshing. In this scenario, the user ping-pongs back and forth between the two displays, making comparisons and adjustments. Just like the Firefox tool for which the inspector is named, it juxtaposes a single task and content source in different forms or contexts in each display. This usage pattern is called the deep diver, and it should look very familiar. It's common to many applications. This pattern consists of an overview and detail relationship between the content in each display. In this scenario, the user is immersed in a single application across monitors, often with a list view on one side and a detail or zoomed in view of the data on the other. For example, this could be a list of accounts or transactions in one monitor and the detail of a single account or transaction in the other monitor. Or it could be an overview of a Photoshop file in one monitor and the pixel level zoomed in view on the other monitor. In this scenario, the dominant monitor is often the detail view and where the user will actually be performing their task. The deep diver will return to the list view to change their selection and update the content that is displayed in the detail view. These four personas generally manifest as a dual monitor display, but the final usage pattern that we're going to discuss today can encompass a much more complex visual layout. We call this the Alexander, and here is a quote to set the stage. When Alexander saw the breadth of his domain, he wept, for there were no more worlds to conquer. Just like Alexander the Great, this persona can see the breadth of his or her domain in a single glance. When the user has expanded their focus to such a large set of displays like this, their attention is fractured by both the quantity and by distance. The majority of this screen real estate is outside their comfortable viewing circumference. The purpose of these screens is therefore likely to be more a general monitoring task as opposed to something focused. This Uber dashboard view generally dedicates a display to each data source and is characterized by the passive interaction between the user and the apps in the majority of these windows. In this scenario, there may not be a dominant display. The user may not use any of these displays to complete their actual task. Rather, they survey all of the displays, often within the context of each other. Examples of the type of user who may orient their monitors this way would include someone like a day trader or a security professional, where 99% of their daily activity is just to monitor and evaluate data. In this case, the data could also include video feeds. The actions that they make based on that data could be something as simple as a keyboard command or an interaction on a completely different system. So instead of entering info into an input field on one of these displays, they may actually need to pick up the phone or get up from their desk and walk down the hall. As with all of these scenarios, each individual's usage patterns will change throughout the day. They will change as they move between tasks. Likewise, many users will move between physical locations, for example, from their workplace to their home office, and may have to adapt to each environment differently. This is not an exhaustive list of multiple monitor scenarios by any means, but it is a good start to get us talking about some of the design considerations. And I will hand it over to Rachel to do that.
Hi, this is Rachel. So we just talked about the ergonomics for people using multiple monitors and some common usage patterns. Now we're going to talk about some of the design considerations to keep in mind when you're designing applications for these kind of users. First, we're going to talk about the topic of organizing and grouping windows. we need to consider how users will actually physically move pages from your application across their monitors so that they can take advantage of having more than one monitor and use your app. Many users don't know how to open links into new browser tabs or new browser windows, or how to tear off browser tabs into separate windows. So in this particular web-based app that we worked on, we gave users a choice. They could choose to always open links from the list in the same window, or have the application automatically open links in a second window. New users are informed about the window settings the first time that they log in. They can change their setting at any time. So let's take a look at how that two-window setting works in this particular app. Here, users wanted a way to see both the list of objects and a detail for an object at the same time. It's that deep diver pattern that Michael just talked about. So here, each time a user clicks on a link in the list, the detail screen automatically opens in a secondary browser window. The user can move that window into another monitor. Each time they open up a detail from the list, it always appears in that exact same secondary window to avoid proliferating too many windows for the users. Do be aware that users have to turn off pop-up blockers in their browser in order to use an app like this. Some design principles that we can derive from this. First, things should appear in new windows consistently. For example, detail screens or help pages, they might always appear in a secondary window. Also, reopen secondary windows in the same size and position the user used before. Most browsers can remember window sizes for the next time that they open the window, the user opens the window. And most browsers can remember the position too, but most browsers cannot remember if it was moved into another monitor, unfortunately. As far as I know, currently Chrome is the only app that can remember placement across multiple monitors. Now, in this app, when users launch forms, the forms appear in an overlay on the parent window by default. But the user can then choose to click an explicit pop-out icon to pop the form into a new window if they don't want to obscure the list while they're working on the form, or if it's a complex form that might take them a while to complete and they want to set it aside into another monitor. Now I'm going to hand it over to Lisa to talk about another app example.
Great, thank you. This is an example from a different web-based workflow system that I worked on that's used on two monitors. Through doing user research, we found that some users like to have a lot of things open at once and some don't. Users with multiple monitors typically get used to certain habits for where they're going to do each type of task that they perform. For example, we observed some users who are accustomed to a particular monitor as the primary go-to place for writing documents, and they always write documents in that monitor. So we wanted to make sure that the system would accommodate those habits, and therefore we created preferences to allow users to decide how they want items to open. We're looking at the preferences area now, and here users can choose to open new cases, that's what they call the work item that they need to do, from their to-do list. And they can open them either in the same window, in a new browser window, or in a new browser tab. If they choose new tab, as shown here, then when they click on the item in the to-do list, it opens a new tab, which keeps them all together within that same browser window. They might work on it for a little while and then go back to their to-do list and open up something else to work on. So users might like to work this way if they feel a bit overwhelmed by having a lot of windows open at once, or if they prefer to use their second monitor on the desk for an entirely different task, such as doing their email or using reference material. Now let's go back to those preferences again. If they choose new window, the case will open in a new browser window that can potentially be placed on a different monitor. Users like to work this way if they're comfortable with multitasking, or if they want to make use of the multiple monitor display in order to view and compare different things side by side. Sometimes the user might want to do something on the fly that is different from their usual preference. This system also has preferences for where to open a new task-based workspace, but we found that users might want something different depending on what they're trying to do. So we placed a small arrow next to each workspace button that lets the user specify where they want to open it. The default behavior is to do their saved preference, but the user can change it by clicking on this arrow. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Rachel to introduce another design principle.
So when we're designing these applications for people using multiple monitors, we need to think about how we're going to design our global navigation menus. In apps that spawn new browser windows, there's typically one primary or master window and multiple secondary or child windows. In this app, only the primary window has global nav menu. In this particular example, there were some technical and user experience considerations that led to that decision. But for your app, you will need to decide, should the same global navigation menu appear on all windows? You'll need to decide what happens if the user navigates to a page that is already open in another window on one of their monitors. Make sure that window is front if it's not already in front. If it's in a monitor further away, they might notice that animation in the corner of their eye as that window comes to front. If you do not have global nav in the child windows, be aware that the user's mouse needs to travel far to get back to the global nav if the parent window is in a different monitor, because as Lisa explained earlier, mouse movement between monitors is a bit challenging. And then I'll hand it over to Lisa now.
In this application, the primary window and the secondary window have nearly the same navigation. The only real difference is that the primary window has a button that goes back to the home page where the user finds their to-do list. The child windows have the same navigation to other things like recently viewed items, to searching. They can see alerts there, and they can access their preferences. That's because users may have moved the child windows around to a different monitor than the primary window, and this helps to ensure that they don't overlook an alert, for example, and can respond to interruptions and multitasking without having to navigate back and find the home screen. We did briefly have a version of this implemented without that top nav in the child window, and it caused frustration for the users because they couldn't easily switch tasks when needed. Now, here's the problem. Whenever you have primary and secondary windows in an application, there's this inevitable question of, what if the user closes the primary window? So what should this do? Should it shut down the application? Can they continue working in the child windows? From the secondary window, do they need a way to get back to the primary window? Unfortunately, we don't have a good answer for this that works all the time. In our experience, technical constraints play a big role in determining what can and should happen in these situations. So we're going to go ahead and talk about page layout next. In addition to having multiple monitors, the monitors themselves are becoming wider, which means we also need to think differently about the page layout. Many applications are designed for narrower width screens because it's considered safer, that lowest likely screen resolution. But users become frustrated when applications waste screen real estate and require too much vertical scrolling. We used to try to address variations in width by using liquid layout, and still do sometimes, allowing content to expand to fill the available space. But the problem is that as monitors get wider, this can have negative consequences. On a large monitor, a page might not be usable anymore when it expands too much using liquid layout. The labels can become too far from the fields, and tables can be hard to read across, and even a simple line of copy might be too wide to read comfortably. So it seems like we need to think differently. We're starting to move towards thinking of applications as being comprised of modular components that can be resized and repositioned. In this illustration, there's a side panel and then several independent tools open side by side. And each of these tools is a gadget that can resize to being narrower or wider. This is basically responsive design, but it's treating each modular area of the UI as its own separate responsive design project. So we've been exploring the use of a docking framework that allows users to reposition independent gadgets on the screen. The gadgets can be dragged and dropped to change the layout. Here, a gadget is moved to a different region of the screen, allowing that wide screen to be resized to a more moderate width. This helps address the needs of users who change their monitor orientation, as well as providing flexibility for users to set up their workspace in a way that feels comfortable to them. Now I'm going to hand it over to Rachel to introduce the next design principle.
So when users are task switching across multiple windows, we want to help them identify and navigate to our application's windows. And we want to ensure that they don't confuse similar objects in our application, so they don't accidentally take action on the wrong object if they have lots of things open. We also realize that users rely on tools from their operating system and their browser in order to navigate to open windows, and there are some things that we can do to help them with this as well. So it's helpful to have a distinctive branded favorite icon for your app. It's displayed in that browser tab, the browser Chrome. Your users can use that fave icon to help find your app's pages amongst the forest of all their browser windows and browser tabs that they have open. You also should consider using page title attributes to identify your app and also to differentiate between different pages in your app. And hand it back over to Lisa.
So when users are task switching across multiple windows, we use signposting to help them identify what they're looking at and ensure that they don't confuse objects. This example shows visible signposting at the top of the screen, a large ID number, and a title to identify the case that the user is looking at. It also visually indicates which workspace they're in. In addition to signposting on the screen, we also leverage the browser page title in web applications to help users navigate between multiple open windows. The page title appears in the tab if the user has multiple browser tabs open. When hovering over the browser icon in the bottom tray, the Windows operating system displays a thumbnail image of the minimized screen. The identifying number on the screen is actually large enough that it's readable in the thumbnail. And these titles have been constructed with short identifying information at the beginning so that that information is seen before the rest is truncated. When even more windows are open, it may collapse into something more like this. The page title is critical here because now there's no image to differentiate them, and it's still very important to put the keywords at the beginning of the string so that users can skim that list and quickly see what they're looking for. We added color coding of related windows in this application also as an additional visual cue to what people are looking at. If the user has several different cases open and has several different workspaces for each case, we wanted to make sure that they can see at a glance what they're looking at, and if they try to start comparing things, they need to know for sure what goes together. So we tried two different color coding options, one that emphasized the identifying information about the case, and one that emphasized the workspace or task, what the user was doing. In this example, color coding is used to visually group windows that pertain to the same work item. In this alternative option, color coding is used to visually group windows that pertain to the same task. We did some A/B testing on this, and most users preferred the color coding that emphasized the same case as going together.
So here's another example of signposting. We showed you this example earlier. In this application, you may recall users can pop out forms into a new window. The forms say which object that you're acting on so that even if you move it into another monitor and it gets divorced from the list, you still know the object that you're affecting. The top of the form also includes a hyperlink to the object's detail page if users need to get more information about the object that they're operating on in the form. Something we've also done on several projects to help users navigate multiple windows is to provide a list of recently viewed pages. It's kind of like our own custom version of the Windows operating system tray, but we can decide ourselves what information to display about each page in this list. In this particular app, a tray comes from the bottom, and any page the user currently has open or has recently viewed appears in this tray. And this isn't Just like your browser's history, these cards are customized. They give user a little bit more context about each page rather than simply listing the page. When users click on a link in this tray to a detail page, it appears in that secondary browser window, and they can move it into their other monitor if they want. Each time they click on a link to a detail page, the existing secondary window is brought to front. If that existing window is in a second monitor, hopefully the movement of it coming to front will catch the user's eye. Now, designers should also consider how to let users know something has changed in a window that's not currently in their focus. That window might be in a different monitor, or it might be hidden behind other windows. An example of that might be a user requests an action to take in your application, and that action takes a long time to process. Users want to know when the action is complete, but they don't want to have to keep staring at the page to see when it's done. Notifications can help the user know that something's been changed. Toast notifications are little messages that appear in the corner of the user's dominant monitor. Here's an example from the Slack application. We humans are hardwired to pay attention to motion in the periphery of our vision. Lisa talked about that in the beginning of our webinar. So things that fly in from the side, they will get our attention. So these toasts fly in and then they disappear after a short period of time. That means users don't need to touch them. They can ignore them if they want. There's also a benefit of this type of toast. It is not tied to your app's browser window. It is not a JavaScript alert built into your application. It is a part of the operating system that the user has. It will appear in the user's dominant monitor, even if your app's window is out of view. This uses a technology called web push notifications that is supported now in many browsers. So you can utilize them for your web-based application. Your users need to opt in to receive toasts for your app. You can even have them set up preferences if you want for specific types of things that they want to get toasts for. Now, it's helpful, of course, to have a quick way to turn on some kind of do not disturb mode because toasts can be distracting when the user is trying to focus on a task. Now, there's also email notifications. You could provide users with an ad hoc choice. So, give me an option to email me when this particular process is done, or you could give them persistent preferences, like in this example from the base CRM, where I can say that anytime I do an import, I automatically want to get an email when the import process is complete. Now, users do tend to check their email pretty habitually, so they may actually look there sooner than look back at your own app to see whether something's done or there's something to pay attention to. And we talked about toasts on the previous slide. Many users actually have the toast feature set on in their email software like Outlook. So if they get an email notification, it's going to bounce on their screen when it comes in, similar to a toast, and that will call their attention. There's also audio alerts. This example is from Slack again. You can choose a sound for notifications. You can choose to have a different sound for each Slack team that you belong to. So that ability to assign different audio sounds to different types of alerts, that helps users know the level of urgency. It helps them know whether they need to turn their head right now to that other monitor to pay attention to what's going on in that other window, or whether they can stay focused and straight ahead looking at the current task in their current monitor. So our colleague, Ifat Yacobi, she worked on the Fordham Security app. It lets users assign sounds to different types of alerts. And at one of the airports, they discovered that the users there had assigned a cow sound, moo, to the highest security room in the airport. So that meant whenever they heard that very distinctive sound, it let them know the situation was super critical and all hands needed to be on deck. Now, another thing that you can consider is telling the user what happened while they weren't focused on your app's window. So with the Slack messaging app, users can put the Slack browser window aside in a separate monitor further away while they focus on a different task in their dominant monitor. Now, when the user comes back to that Slack window later, it lets them know new messages that came in while they were not focused on its browser window. Now, if your app has a page that has things on it that are processing, users might, hide that page for a while, but they might not. They might actually put that page up in a monitor, maybe further away, while they're waiting for it to be done. So it is helpful to make sure that the statuses can easily be seen from far away. And you might consider the use of animations as well to help convey a change in status if it's important for users to notice that. And think also about dashboards. If your users tend to put them in displays in their periphery for monitoring, that's that Alexander scenario that Michael talked about, make the status graphics big and visible from far away, and do automatic periodic refreshes instead of forcing the user to manually refresh the page content. Because, as Lisa mentioned before, moving your mouse to another monitor does take some effort. Now, the browser title is your friend if you need to dynamically notify people of updates. There are some interesting things you can do now with page titles and fave icons to help people know what's going on in other tabs. So here is an example from Facebook and from Twitter. The number of new updates are signposted in the browser tab, and they are updated periodically. And in Slack, when there is a new unread direct message, a red shape appears on the tab's fave icon. Now here's an example from Facebook. When someone messages you, there is an animation on the Facebook tab, and you can see that on the top right of the slide. That page title animates, and that animation catches your eye. Here's an example from GitHub where the color of the fave icon conveys system status. Here's an example from Flickr where the fave icon is dynamically updated as the upload progresses. And the page title also lets you know dynamically how far along it is. Now I'm going to hand it over to Michael to talk about another topic.
So another facet of the issue of window management that we need to consider is the user's environment. As we've mentioned previously, users tend to change locations during the course of their day. One of the things we as UX designers need to consider is how that transitioning between monitor configurations will affect a user's experience with our application. Whether someone is heading to their home office or simply taking their laptop down the hall to a conference room, the environments they're switching between are rarely exactly the same. In some cases where you're plugging your laptop into a conference room projector, your display may be radically different than what you have at your desk. As a designer, you need to ask yourself how this will affect the way that users interact with your application. Will your application downgrade gracefully? In this example, our client was specifically concerned about how the application would behave during sales presentations. While their core user base was almost exclusively in a multiple monitor environment, the sales team was taking the app on the road with laptops and projectors. Core users preferred that the system pop pages out into new windows so that they could take advantage of their multiple displays. But the client needed the option to keep the application's pages in one single window on demand for their sales team. Web applications at this time cannot automatically detect if you have one or more multiple monitors connected to your computer. So we had to provide users with a way to manually control the behavior of the app. The user accesses this feature in their preferences and can optimize their experience to suit their environment. When users are on a single display, they're forced back into a linear usage pattern when interacting with the application. In addition, the interface adapts to provide navigation on the detail window to compensate, so the user can now move more easily between the detail and the list. For users who have already spawned multiple windows, their only option currently is to manually anchor them back into a primary window. A better solution would be to automatically collect and arrange windows for the user, or to give them a one-click way to collapse multiple windows back into a single monitor-friendly arrangement. While not a practical solution yet for web-based applications, some native apps like Photoshop, pictured here, have some nice tools to help users with multiple windows. Via Photoshop's menu, a user can select multiple window layouts to gather their windows back into the single main screen. It remains to be seen whether tools like this will be next on the horizon for web-based applications, or will someone come up with a completely different solution?
Michael's going to kind of wrap things up now.
Thank you, Rachel. Our industry is one that evolves quickly. UX designers have long accepted that they are responsible for considering how their websites and web-based applications will be used across devices. Whether we're thinking about the accessibility of website content to users via screen reader, or considering responsive design and the implications of content wrapping properly down to a smartphone display width, it is within the UX designer's purview to plan for, design, and test their concepts across multiple devices. Today, we're acknowledging that this planning, designing, and testing needs to encompass a continuum of display sizes and orientations, a continuum that must include multiple monitor scenarios like the ones we've discussed here today.
So thank you, everybody. We're now in the question and answer portion of the webinar. So we invite your questions. You can put them in the questions tab. I think, Lisa, you've been taking a look at some of those questions. So let us know if there's some particular questions we should get started with now.
So far, the only two questions we have are about posting the recording and slides. So we did forget to cover that at the beginning. The slides are currently available on the Design for Context website. That's designforcontext.com. And UXPA is also planning to publish the recording from today's session. Do you want to speak a little bit about how that recording will be published?
Yeah, and I can definitely speak about that. So I'm going to upload the recording to the UXPA YouTube channel, and I will send the link of the recording to everybody who has registered for this webinar. So by the end of the day, you might have the link of the recording available to you.
And you'll see a URL at the bottom of the slide that I'm showing right now. There's a URL there for our website, and you can find this presentation there, the slide deck, if you need access to the slide deck.
All right.
No, you can't hear it speaking.
There's a few questions now been posted. I'm going to go through a couple of those. So there's a question, are there general analytics that show how many people generally have a multi-monitor setup? And we did a lot of searching for that as we were first coming up with the proposal for this, and have looked back a few times. It's hard to find statistics like that, unfortunately. There's a lot of statistics out there about monitor size, and we can clearly see that the size and that the width is increasing. There's articles about the use of multiple monitors, and we've found a number of those online. But I don't think we can point you to good, solid statistics, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I mentioned earlier that browsers, or I think Michael mentioned that browsers cannot detect whether you have more than one monitor attached. So because browsers can't detect that, it's not provided in analytics. So, you know, maybe the browsers will get smart in the future and be able to detect this and then offer it as part of their analytics. So that's one of the reasons why there aren't good analytics out there for this yet.
There's a couple of questions around patterns, the usage patterns that Michael spoke about earlier. There's one asking for clarification about the Alexander pattern, and there's one about whether we feel like there's a dominant usage pattern that we think is most important to design for. Do you guys want to speak to that?
I don't think there's necessarily a dominant usage pattern generally. I think it really depends on the type of application that you're building. If your application lends itself to the list in detail type scenario, then that's generally what your users are going to be doing, whereas a lot of applications are more comparison. It really depends on what the specific tasks are that your users are doing.
Okay. There's a question about when we found that users didn't know they could open links in a new window, did we notice that some issues were due to the demographic of the users or from the interface? So I think in general, we found that nobody except developers and IT people really know how to open things in a new window. That's certainly been my experience working with very, very smart, highly educated, lawyers and PhDs and very smart people are very unaware of those types of controls in my experience. Anybody want to add anything to that?
I've seen that as well. It's people that are a little bit more tech savvy and are in the technical design or development realm tend to be aware of it more than others. We did talk to a couple of cybersecurity folks, right? And some of them certainly seem to be aware of this because they are very technically savvy. So they were taking advantage of that kind of thing.
Right. There's a question about, have we had challenges getting developers or other stakeholders to buy into these considerations? I think it depends on the project.
Yeah.
Yes,
I think it also depends on the stakeholders and the users and how much they advocate for this. I had one or two projects where there was some active stakeholders in the user community really advocating to make sure that we take advantage of the multiple monitors that almost all of the users had on their desktops.
Yeah, I think that's a big difference. We've had projects where almost the entire user group was on multiple monitors. So it wasn't, having to justify what percentage of our users are using multiple monitors. We came at it from that base assumption that everyone was using a multiple monitor, and that made it a much easier sell.
Right. A related question is, what industries are you finding the need for multiple monitors? And we do have some experience with seeing a lot of this happening in things like security, definitely security monitoring and data security, and things where there's a task that maybe people have to keep an eye on something that's running in the background while doing something else. We've also run into it a lot in finance, trading, stock trading, that kind of thing, where people are keeping an eye on information and doing tasks. You guys want to suggest some other examples of industries?
I think when we talk about the different scenarios, the multitasker is really applicable to any user case. They're using multiple applications, they're doing different things. This is applicable to people, at home, browsing Facebook and checking email. I think the other scenarios are more specific really to enterprise applications. And I think that's, what the focus is there.
Okay. There's a question about whether we can talk about going from multiple monitors to a mobile experience and back. It's kind of what Michael touched on towards the end there about scaling down and scaling up again, but mobile is a step further.
Yeah, and I think that's a huge challenge. There are no easy solutions for making those big jumps. I think
Go ahead.
I was going to say, as we pointed out, navigation is really important, making sure that users can still navigate your application. there are two different issues. There's, okay, I'm using this application on multiple monitors. I'm using it on a really big monitor. I'm using it on my tablet or my smartphone versus I'm on my laptop. I plugged it in at my desk. Then I took it home and I'm using it while I sit on the couch. So I've already got my windows open. Can I still use my application, or do I have to just close everything and start over? And that's really what you want to try to avoid.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think there's kind of two scenarios here. One is, okay, I'm at the desk and I'm using multiple monitors, and then I'm going home and all I have at home is a tablet or a phone, and I've got to get my work done, right? So that is very much a continuum of what we already have to deal with as designers of cross-platform things that are used cross-platform. I don't think it's very different from that. And then there is the situation Michael just mentioned. I've got my laptop connected, then I disconnected. And then there's another situation that we're starting to see, and that is having my phone next to me, and I've got multiple monitors, and I'm using the same app on all of them, or using apps that complement each other. It's something that I haven't done a whole lot of research into, but I know that I've been hearing anecdotally that that's happening more and more with the developer use space. That the developers are doing that a lot more. So that's also that would be an interesting new territory to look in. I've got, can they use that phone for something in my application along with the things that they've got going on in their two monitors?
Right. There's a question here about if there's any special considerations around multiple monitor use if a web-based application will be used in multiple countries. I don't know that we've run into anything specific on that. Rachel, can you think of anything?
No, I haven't come across research to talk about that.
Right.
And there's also. Go ahead.
I said I haven't either, but I think it's a really good question.
Yeah, definitely worth exploring. Somebody posted an answer here about industries that in oil, I think it was, that's also a very standard thing to have two monitors on the desk. We're seeing it so often now that two monitors on the desk, at least in the office environment, is a really typical thing. And we kind of have to think about the implications of that. There's a question about should you rely on training to let people know that there are different options available, like those setting menus that we showed, and how can we help with discoverability of those options?
I don't think you can rely on training. Unfortunately, not every user will have access. You can't guarantee that every user will have access to the same training. And users, a lot of the new users coming in may have access to training, but users who have been there, it's not in their schedule. They don't have time for it, and it doesn't happen, and they miss out on the functionality you have then. There are different ways that you need to be able to let users know about some of these features. And we've explored some of those, tips of the day kind of thing. Mm-hmm.
There's also that example we showed earlier on in the webinar where the first time users clicked on a link that could spawn a new window, that they were informed of the options, and they could choose an option, and they were told how to change it later on. So kind of at the first use, giving them a tip or advice the first time they try something is another, it's one of the handled discoverability.
Right. There's a question about, have we seen a transition from multiple monitors to one really large monitor? And are there any guidance ideas around that?
So we don't have any analytics on this, on use of one monitor versus multiple monitors, as mentioned before. So that's tough, but we do have the analytics on that, monitors are getting larger and larger, and you do have some extreme large monitors. And anecdotally, just from my own use of those kind of monitors, I noticed that a lot of the patterns we've talked about apply there as well. You've got this huge canvas, and you tend to be focused You know, if you're using it for task, not for the Alexander model, but if you're using it for task, you might be on, you know, one side of the monitor working on it. You might not notice what's going on at the other side. You know, you've got some windows open on the other side. There's a lot of similarities there on the extreme, largely large monitors, if you're using them, you know, for task work, not for the monitoring work.
Right. There's a comment here about the financial industry, also the analysts who use something like the Bloomberg display. I don't know if you guys have seen those, but there's 6 monitors that are typically, you know, kind of set up to run simultaneously different information in each monitor. If you go from there and then walk into a meeting, you might still need that information with you, but in a much more condensed format. It's an interesting challenge. You know, we are about at time. Is there anything that UXPA wants to say to wrap this up?
Yes, just want to thank you all. Thanks so much for this webinar. Again, I mean, if you have any other questions and feedback about this webinar or suggestions for future webinars, please reach out using the education@uxpa.org email. And I will be sending the recording link to everyone later today. So thanks so much. Thanks, Rachel, Lisa, and Michael.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.